Okay, so what about human fossils? Okay, so the Bible clearly talks that there were humans before the flood. It even talks about cities before the flood. Okay, so you're looking at not a huge population, but a fairly substantial population. The trouble is with human fossils is in order to work out the likelihood of you finding human fossils, you need to work out how many people there were living before the flood. And that is virtually impossible to do for several reasons. First of all, the Bible gives us very, very little detail about life before the flood. Okay, the first part of the flood talks about in Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is about the creation of the world. Genesis chapter 3 is about mankind falling. You're only looking at a very brief section in Genesis chapter 4 where it actually talks about life before the flood, and most of that is filled in with genealogy. Okay, he so begat, so on and so forth. Okay, and it talks a little bit, so it talks about little snippets of golden information about Jubal Cain, who worked with bronze and iron, and the people who did the artwork. It gives you these little snippets, but they're only tiny little snippets about what the world was before the flood. The one main thing it tells you about the world before the flood was that the wickedness was great. Every thought and intent of the heart was evil continually, which is possibly why God doesn't actually record that much about the time before the flood, because it was so bad, right? So we've got very, very limited information to work with. We know these people were intelligent because they were created in the image of God. We also know that these people lived a lot longer. Now, if you want to try and do a little bit of population statistics, okay, what you want to do is look at the human body and look at what is the optimum age and the optimum space between having children. And what you actually find from a biological perspective is you're actually looking at a few years before you have children. Today people can have ladies can have children just a year after they've given birth, and sometimes they're even encouraged to do that in some cultures around the world, but that puts a lot of stress on the poor woman. That's a lot of stress on the poor human body. An optimum level is actually a lot further apart, and there is definitely something spiritual about having babies. It's not just about the womb and the growth and that kind of stuff. So the Bible says before you were in the womb I knew you. There's definitely something spiritual going on about babies being created. Okay, so if you look at the optimum time between having babies, you've got a lot longer space, but you've also got people living a lot longer. Adam living up to 930 years. You've got people living a lot longer anyway. So it's really difficult to actually work out how big a population there was before. But one thing for sure, it would have been nothing like today. Okay, you're talking about a population of possibly in the tens of thousands to millions. Okay, so a relatively small population as we view the population today. Okay, then you've also got to understand, when you have the flood coming on, human beings were created in God's image. They were intelligent, okay? They're going to try and escape the flood waters. Now, obviously, it's going to be a futile attempt anyway, because the whole purpose of the flood was to come and destroy all of mankind. But these people are going to try and get to higher ground. They're going to cling on. They could even make some boats, even try and basically escape the oncoming waters. So human beings, as a general rule, would have been the last living things to die. And if you want to, I really wouldn't recommend it, but if you look at some of the horrifying footage of when places like Japan had the great big tsunamis, what you find with people when they die, when they drown, they don't get buried. They bloat and they float. It's horrible, horrible pictures, but it makes a very, very good point. Humans are really difficult to bury and fossilize, because when we drown, we bloat and we float. So you've got all these humans now bloated and floated, okay? The chances of some of them being fossilized, it's possible, but the chances of then finding them in the huge amount of sediment that we have around the world means our chances of finding them are actually really teeny tiny anyway. Now, there are one or two examples of human fossils from flood rocks. And I say from flood rocks because there are many human fossils, most of them after the flood. Because remember, to make a fossil, you need to preserve something in rock, and you can do that today. You just get the right process. All right, but there are many human fossils that have been formed after the flood, and one or two that are very likely to be formed during the flood. The trouble is in trying to find them, in actually being able to do study on them, because as you can imagine, it kind of goes against the evolutionary story a little bit of humans being found alongside or underneath dinosaurs, actually, in the case of the one that was discovered. So they're almost impossible to see. You have to go on old original records of them. But from the original records, as far as we can see, they are genuine human fossils from flood rock. But like I say, it's almost unprovable in the sense that you can't find these fossils to actually look and hold in your hand. If I could have one in my hand and I could do a couple of tests on it, I'd be able to tell you, yeah, it's definitely human, that's definitely flood rock. But getting hold of them is virtually impossible. So if you put it all together, human population fairly small, human population when they die in the flood, most of them bloated and floated, relatively few being buried in a huge amount of rock around the world, the chances of finding a human fossil is really, really slim. So it doesn't go against the Bible story at all. It just means what was the flood here for the first place? It was judgment on mankind. It was to destroy all of mankind. The chances of these humans being all fossilized in preserved, when God judges, he doesn't tend to leave a remain. Just think of Sodom and Gomorrah. He would wipe them out from the face of the earth. Doesn't seem likely that he's going to leave a preservation of the human race, the evil human race, before the flood. So that's the kind of the answers that you can give towards what happened to the human fossils, or where are the human fossils.